Corporal Heinrich Krause stood in the middle of an endless Iowa cornfield, his hands trembling as an American farmer placed a ripe ear of corn into his palm and smiled. For months, Heinrich had expected punishment, hard labor, or worse, but instead, this weathered farmer was teaching him patiently how to harvest corn properly, even cracking jokes in broken German. At the end of that long day, something happened that Heinrich would never forget. The farmer invited him and his fellow prisoners to sit at a table, to eat fresh corn from the very harvest they had worked on together. In that moment, Heinrich realized something profound. He wasn't being treated as the enemy anymore. For the first time since his capture, he felt like a man again. But how did a German soldier end up in the heart of America's farmland, and what led to this unexpected moment of humanity in the middle of a brutal war? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The year was 1944, and the war in Europe was reaching a turning point that would reshape the world. Heinrich Krause had been a young corporal in the Wehrmacht, fighting in North Africa under Field Marshal Rommel when his unit was surrounded by Allied forces near Tunisia. The battle had been fierce and chaotic, with sand and smoke filling the air as tanks rumbled across the desert landscape. Heinrich remembered the moment of surrender vividly, the way his commanding officer had raised the white flag after days of being cut off from supply lines, the hunger gnawing at his stomach, the thirst that made his tongue feel like leather. He had stood there with his hands raised above his head, watching American soldiers approach with their rifles pointed forward, expecting the worst. But instead of violence, he was given water. Instead of execution, he was loaded onto a transport truck with dozens of other German prisoners. The journey from North Africa to America had been long and disorienting. Heinrich and his fellow POWs were first taken to a processing center in Algeria, where they were documented, photographed, and assigned prisoner numbers. From there, they boarded ships that would carry them across the Atlantic Ocean, a voyage that took weeks and left many of them seasick and weak. Heinrich spent most of the journey below deck, cramped in tight quarters with hundreds of other prisoners, all of them wondering what fate awaited them in America. Some of the men whispered rumors they had heard about American prison camps, stories of brutal treatment and starvation, while others remained silent, lost in thoughts of home and families they might never see again. Heinrich tried not to think about his mother in Munich or his younger sister who had been only 16 when he left for the war. Instead, he focused on survival, on making it through one day at a time. When the ship finally docked in New York Harbor, Heinrich caught his first glimpse of America through a small porthole. The Statue of Liberty rose in the distance, her torch held high against a gray autumn sky. It was October of 1944, and the air was crisp and cool, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat of North Africa. The prisoners were unloaded from the ship and immediately placed onto trains, their destination unknown. Heinrich and about 200 other German POWs were herded into boxcars that smelled of hay and livestock, and for 2 days they traveled westward across a landscape that seemed impossibly vast. Heinrich pressed his face against the narrow gaps in the wooden slats, watching as cities gave way to farmland, as forests transformed into rolling plains, as the urban industrial world faded into something rural and peaceful. The train finally stopped in a small town in Iowa called Fairmont, a place Heinrich had never heard of and couldn't have found on a map if his life depended on it. The prisoners were marched off the train in single file, their boots crunching on gravel as armed guards supervised their every move. Heinrich looked around at the landscape, taking in the endless fields of corn that stretched in every direction, the wide open sky that seemed bigger than any sky he had ever seen in Germany, the small wooden houses with their painted shutters and neat gardens. It was so different from what he had expected. There were no massive prison walls or barbed wire fences extending for miles, no guard towers looming over them with searchlights and machine guns. Instead, they were led to a camp that consisted of simple barracks surrounded by a single fence, with guards posted at intervals, but nothing that seemed overly hostile or threatening. The camp itself was built on the edge of town, close enough that Heinrich could see the church steeple and the water tower rising above the rooftops of Fairmont. The barracks were plain wooden structures with rows of bunk beds inside, each one covered with a thin mattress and a wool blanket. There was a mess hall where the prisoners would take their meals, a recreation area with a few benches and tables, and a small building that served as the camp headquarters where the American officers conducted their business. When Heinrich and his fellow POWs were shown to their assigned bunks, they found that each man had a small footlocker for personal belongings and a hook on the wall for hanging clothes. It was sparse but not cruel, functional but not deliberately harsh. Heinrich had expected far worse based on the stories he had heard during his training in the Wehrmacht, stories of American savagery and lawlessness that now seemed like propaganda designed to keep soldiers fighting rather than surrendering. That first night in the camp, Heinrich lay on his bunk and listened to the sounds of rural Iowa drifting through the thin walls of the barracks. He could hear crickets chirping in the darkness, the distant lowing of cattle from a nearby farm, the soft rustle of cornstalks moving in the breeze. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost unreal after years of war, after months of living with the constant threat of death hanging over his head. He thought about his comrades who had not been as fortunate, the men who had died in the desert or been captured by Soviet forces on the Eastern Front, where the treatment of prisoners was notoriously brutal. Heinrich knew that he was lucky to be here, even if here meant being a prisoner thousands of miles from home. At least he was alive, and that was more than many could say. The next morning, the prisoners were awakened before dawn by the sound of a bell ringing across the camp. Heinrich stumbled out of his bunk along with the other men, all of them groggy and disoriented as they pulled on their clothes and lined up outside the barracks for roll call. An American officer with a clipboard went down the line, checking names and prisoner numbers, his voice crisp and businesslike in the cold morning air. When roll call was finished, the prisoners were marched to the mess hall where they were served breakfast, consisting of oatmeal, bread, and coffee. The food was plain but adequate, better than what Heinrich had eaten during the final days in North Africa, when rations had been cut to almost nothing. He ate quickly, shoveling spoonfuls of oatmeal into his mouth, while trying to ignore the nervous chatter of the men around him. Everyone was wondering the same thing. What would happen to them now? What kind of work would they be forced to do, and how would they be treated by their American captors? After breakfast, the prisoners were assembled in the recreation area where a tall American officer addressed them through an interpreter. The officer introduced himself as Captain Robert Jenkins, the commandant of the camp, and he explained in clear, measured tones that the prisoners would be put to work helping local farmers with the harvest. There was a severe labor shortage in America due to so many men being away fighting in Europe and the Pacific, and the farmers in Iowa desperately needed help bringing in their crops before winter arrived. The prisoners would be paid a small wage for their work, 80 cents per day, which they could use to purchase items from the camp canteen, such as cigarettes, chocolate, or writing paper. They would be treated fairly and humanely according to the Geneva Convention, and any prisoner who attempted to escape or cause trouble would face serious consequences. Captain Jenkins spoke with authority, but not cruelty, his tone suggesting that he viewed the prisoners as men who had simply been on the wrong side of a conflict rather than as monsters who needed to be punished. Heinrich listened to the interpreter translate the captain's words into German, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. The idea of working on a farm seemed almost absurdly peaceful compared to what he had been through, but he wondered how the local farmers would react to having German prisoners on their land. Would they be hostile? Would they view the POWs as enemies who deserved harsh treatment? Heinrich had heard stories about how Germans living in America had faced discrimination and suspicion during the First World War, and he assumed that the presence of German soldiers, even prisoners, would be met with anger or fear. He prepared himself mentally for hostility, for cold glares and harsh words, for the kind of treatment that seemed inevitable when working for people whose country you had been fighting against. The prisoners were divided into groups of about 20 men each, and Heinrich found himself assigned to a work detail that would be sent to various farms in the surrounding countryside. His group consisted mostly of younger soldiers like himself, men in their 20s and early 30s who had been captured in North Africa or Italy and shipped to America. There was Franz, a quiet man from Bavaria who had worked as a carpenter before the war. Josef, a former schoolteacher from Berlin who spoke excellent English, and Klaus, a farmer's son from the Rhineland, who joked that he was finally going back to his roots. The men bonded quickly over their shared circumstances, finding comfort in dark humor and small acts of camaraderie that helped them cope with the strangeness of their situation. On the first morning of work, Heinrich and his group were loaded onto the back of a flatbed truck along with two armed guards who sat in the cab with the driver. The truck rumbled down dirt roads that cut through the Iowa countryside, past farmhouses with silos and barns painted bright red, past fields where combines harvested wheat and oats, past small creeks that wound lazily through the landscape. Heinrich watched the scenery pass by, struck by how untouched by war this place seemed. There were no bombed-out buildings or cratered roads, no refugees fleeing with their belongings piled on carts, no evidence of the destruction that had consumed so much of Europe. America felt like a different world, a place where normal life continued even as the war raged on other continents. The truck finally turned off the main road and onto a long gravel driveway that led to a large farm. Heinrich could see acres and acres of cornfields stretching out in every direction, the stalks tall and golden in the autumn sunlight. The farmhouse itself was a two-story white structure with green shutters and a wide front porch where a dog lay sleeping in a patch of sunlight. As the truck came to a stop, a man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag and walking toward them with slow, deliberate steps. He was in his 50s, with weathered skin and strong hands that spoke of decades of hard physical labor. His name was Walter Hoffmann, and as he approached the truck, Heinrich noticed that he was smiling. Walter Hoffmann was a second-generation German-American whose grandparents had immigrated to Iowa in the 1880s, settling in this fertile farming region and building a life from the land. Walter spoke both English and German fluently, having grown up in a household where both languages were used interchangeably. And he had maintained a deep connection to his German heritage, even as he considered himself fully American. When he learned that German POWs would be available to help with the harvest, Walter had volunteered to take a work detail on his farm, partly because he needed the labor, but also because he felt a sense of kinship with these young men who had found themselves on the losing side of a war. Walter understood that war was complicated, that soldiers were often just ordinary people caught up in forces beyond their control, and he believed in treating others with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. As the prisoners climbed down from the truck, Walter greeted them in German, his accent carrying the same Bavarian inflection that Heinrich recognized from home. The effect was immediate and profound. The POWs, who had been tense and wary, visibly relaxed when they heard their native language spoken with warmth and familiarity. Walter introduced himself and explained that they would be working on harvesting corn, a crop that many of them had never seen before. He told them that the work would be hard but fair, that they would take breaks when needed, and that at the end of the day, they would all share a meal together. Heinrich exchanged glances with Franz and Josef, all of them surprised by the kindness in Walter's voice and the lack of hostility in his demeanor. Walter led the group into the cornfield, the stalks towering over their heads and rustling in the breeze like a living organism. For many of the prisoners, this was their first close encounter with American corn, which grew much taller and fuller than the varieties they knew from Germany. Walter demonstrated how to harvest corn properly, showing them how to grasp the ear firmly, twist it downward, and pull it away from the stalk in one smooth motion. He explained that they needed to check each ear for ripeness, looking for kernels that were plump and full, avoiding any that showed signs of disease or pest damage. He moved down the row with practiced efficiency, filling a large burlap sack with ears of corn while talking casually about the weather, the soil quality, and the challenges of farming in Iowa. Heinrich watched Walter carefully, mimicking his movements as he reached for his first ear of corn. The husk felt rough and dry under his fingers, and when he twisted the ear downward as Walter had shown him, it came away from the stalk with a satisfying snap. He placed it in his sack and moved on to the next plant, then the next, gradually finding a rhythm that made the work feel less foreign and more natural. Around him, the other prisoners were doing the same, some struggling at first, but quickly getting the hang of it. The guards who had accompanied them from the camp stood at the edge of the field, their rifles slung over their shoulders, watching but not interfering. They seemed relaxed, almost bored, as if they knew that none of these men were going to cause any trouble. As the morning wore on, the sun climbed higher in the sky and the temperature rose, making the work more difficult. Heinrich felt sweat soaking through his shirt as he moved down the rows, his arms aching from the repetitive motion of reaching, twisting, and pulling. But Walter was true to his word about breaks. Every hour or so, he would call for the men to stop and gather in the shade of a large oak tree that stood at the edge of the field. There, Walter had set up a water station with a large metal barrel filled with cold well water and several tin cups hanging on hooks. The prisoners drank gratefully, splashing water on their faces and necks to cool down, while Walter sat on a stump and talked to them about his farm, his family, and life in Iowa. During one of these breaks, Walter pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered them around to the prisoners. Heinrich hesitated for a moment before accepting one, still not quite able to believe that his captor was sharing tobacco with him as if they were equals. Walter struck a match and lit Heinrich's cigarette, then his own, and for a few minutes they stood there smoking in comfortable silence, looking out over the cornfield, where dozens of workers moved up and down the rows. Walter asked Heinrich where he was from in Germany, and when Heinrich mentioned Munich, Walter's face lit up with recognition. He told Heinrich that his grandmother had been from a small village near Munich, and that she used to make the most incredible apple strudel that Walter still dreamed about decades after her death. The conversation was easy and natural, lacking any of the tension or animosity that Heinrich had expected. Josef, the former schoolteacher, struck up a conversation with Walter about education and farming, discussing the differences between German and American agricultural methods. Walter explained that Iowa farmers had adopted many modern techniques such as crop rotation and hybrid seeds, which had dramatically increased yields over the past few decades. Joseph listened intently, asking questions and sharing his own knowledge about European farming practices. And soon, the two men were engaged in a lively debate about the merits of different approaches to soil conservation. Heinrich watched this exchange with fascination, realizing that this was perhaps the first time since his capture that he had witnessed a conversation between a German and an American that wasn't about war or surrender or prison regulations. It was just two men talking about ideas, sharing knowledge, treating each other as human beings with valuable perspectives. When the lunch break arrived, Walter surprised the prisoners again by inviting them to eat with him and his family, rather than eating separately as they had expected. The prisoners were led to a large barn where long wooden tables had been set up in the shade. Walter's wife, Margaret, appeared from the farmhouse carrying baskets of food, her face kind but cautious as she looked at the German prisoners who would be sharing their meal. She had prepared sandwiches made with thick slices of homemade bread, sliced ham, and fresh cheese, along with jars of pickles, bowls of coleslaw, and a large pitcher of lemonade. There was also fresh corn that had been boiled and slathered with butter, the ears still steaming and fragrant. The prisoners sat at the tables, their eyes wide with surprise at the abundance of food laid out before them. In the prison camp, meals were adequate but plain, and the sight of such a generous spread felt almost overwhelming. Walter said a brief prayer before the meal, thanking God for the food and for the hands that would help harvest it, and then he invited everyone to eat. Heinrich picked up a sandwich and bit into it, the flavors exploding on his tongue after months of bland prison food. The bread was soft and fresh, the ham was salty and rich, and the cheese had a sharpness that made his mouth water. He ate slowly, savoring each bite, hardly able to believe that he was sitting in an Iowa barn, eating lunch as if he were a hired farmhand rather than an enemy prisoner. Margaret moved around the table, refilling cups of lemonade and making sure everyone had enough to eat. She spoke limited German, but managed to communicate through gestures and simple phrases, her warmth evident despite the language barrier. Heinrich noticed that she looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy, as if she saw them as young men far from home rather than as threats or enemies. At one point, she placed an ear of boiled corn on Heinrich's plate and showed him how Americans ate it, holding it by the ends and rolling it to get all the kernels, butter dripping down his chin as he bit into the sweet, tender kernels. It was delicious in a way that Heinrich hadn't expected. The sweetness of the corn complemented perfectly by the salt of the butter, and he found himself reaching for another ear when he finished the first. After lunch, the prisoners returned to the fields, their spirits noticeably lifted by the good food and kind treatment. The afternoon passed more quickly than the morning, perhaps because the men were getting used to the work, or perhaps because the atmosphere had shifted from one of tense uncertainty to something more relaxed and almost companionable. Walter worked alongside them, not supervising from a distance, but actually participating in the harvest, his own sack filling with corn as he moved down the rows. He joked with the prisoners in German, teaching them American slang and laughing when they tried to pronounce English words with their thick accents. Klaus, the farmer's son from the Rhineland, proved to be the fastest worker, his experience with agricultural labor evident in the efficient way he moved through the field. Walter noticed this and complimented Klaus on his skill, asking him about farming in Germany and listening attentively to his responses. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the cornfield, Walter called an end to the workday. The prisoners had filled dozens of large sacks with corn, which now sat in neat rows at the edge of the field waiting to be loaded onto a wagon. Walter surveyed their work with satisfaction, nodding his approval and telling the men that they had done an excellent job for their first day. He thanked them in both German and English, his gratitude genuine and heartfelt. The guards who had been watching over the work detail began gathering the prisoners to load them back onto the truck, but before they left, Walter did something that Heinrich would never forget. Walter walked over to one of the sacks of corn and pulled out several ears, fresh and ripe from the day's harvest. He approached Heinrich and the other prisoners, handing each man an ear of corn and telling them to take it back to the camp with them. He explained that this corn came from their own labor, from the work of their own hands, and that they had earned it. Heinrich held the ear of corn, feeling its weight in his palm, the dry husk rough against his skin. It was such a simple gesture. But in that moment, it meant everything. For months, Heinrich had felt like nothing more than a prisoner, a number in a system, a problem to be managed. But this act of giving him the fruits of his own labor, of acknowledging that his work had value and that he deserved to benefit from it, made him feel human again in a way that he had almost forgotten was possible. As the truck pulled away from the Hoffman farm and headed back toward the camp, Heinrich sat in the back holding his ear of corn and staring out at the Iowa landscape rolling past. The other prisoners were quiet, each man lost in his own thoughts about the day's experiences. Franz finally broke the silence, saying in German that he couldn't believe they had been treated so well, that he had expected much worse from their American captors. Joseph agreed, noting that Walter and his wife had shown them more kindness in one day than they had received from their own officers during the final chaotic months in North Africa. Klaus remained silent, but was peeling back the husk on his ear of corn, examining the kernels with the practiced eye of someone who understood farming, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. When they arrived back at the camp, the prisoners were processed through the gate and allowed to return to their barracks. Heinrich carefully placed his ear of corn in his footlocker, wanting to preserve it as a reminder of the day, though he knew it would eventually dry out and become nothing more than a relic. That evening at dinner in the mess hall, the men who had worked at the Hoffman farm talked excitedly about their experience, sharing details with other prisoners who had been assigned to different work details. Some of the other groups had not been as fortunate. They had worked for farmers who were less friendly, who viewed the German POWs with suspicion or outright hostility, who worked them hard and barely spoke to them except to give orders. Hearing these stories made Heinrich realize how lucky his group had been to be assigned to Walter Hoffman's farm. Over the following weeks, Heinrich and his work detail returned to the Hoffman farm regularly, becoming familiar faces in the cornfields and barn. Each day followed a similar pattern of hard work punctuated by generous breaks, good food, and genuine human interaction. Walter continued to treat the prisoners with respect and dignity, often taking time to teach them not just about corn harvesting, but about American farming in general, about the history of Iowa, and about his own family's journey from Germany to America. Heinrich learned that Walter's grandfather had left Bavaria in 1882 to escape poverty and lack of opportunity, making the difficult journey across the Atlantic with nothing but a single trunk of belongings and a dream of owning his own land. He had settled in Iowa, worked as a farmhand for years, saved every penny, and eventually purchased the land that would become the Hoffman farm. Walter's stories resonated deeply with Heinrich, who began to see parallels between his own situation and that of Walter's grandfather. Both had left Germany under difficult circumstances. Both had ended up in a foreign land where they didn't fully understand the language or customs. Both had to work hard to earn their place in a new society. The difference, of course, was that Walter's grandfather had come voluntarily, while Heinrich had been brought as a prisoner of war, but somehow the underlying human experience felt similar. Both were stories of displacement and adaptation, of finding ways to maintain dignity and hope in challenging circumstances. As the weeks turned into months and autumn deepened into early winter, the corn harvest was completed, and the prisoners were assigned to other agricultural tasks. Heinrich's group helped with the butchering of hogs, the repair of fences and buildings, the preparation of fields for winter dormancy. Through it all, Walter remained a constant presence, always treating the prisoners fairly and often going out of his way to make their work more bearable. He brought hot coffee on cold mornings, shared news from the war that he heard on his radio, and occasionally invited individual prisoners to join him for conversations about their lives before the war. One particularly cold November afternoon, Walter asked Heinrich to help him repair a section of the barn roof where shingles had blown off during a recent windstorm. The two men climbed a tall ladder and spent several hours working together, hammering new shingles into place while the wind whipped around them. During one break, sitting on the roof with their legs dangling over the edge, Walter asked Heinrich about his family in Germany. Heinrich found himself opening up in a way he hadn't since his capture, talking about his mother who worked as a seamstress, about his younger sister who had wanted to be a teacher, about his father who had died when Heinrich was only 12 years old. He talked about his life before the war, about the small apartment in Munich where he had grown up, about the friends he had made in school and the girl he had hoped to marry someday. Walter listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions, but mostly just letting Heinrich talk. When Heinrich finished, Walter was quiet for a moment before sharing his own story. He told Heinrich about losing his eldest son, David, at Normandy during the D-Day invasion just 5 months earlier. David had been 22 years old, full of life and promise, and he had died on a beach in France, fighting against the same German army that Heinrich had served in. Walter's voice cracked as he talked about receiving the telegram, about his wife's grief, about the emptiness that now filled their farmhouse, where David's room remained exactly as he had left it. Heinrich felt his throat tighten with emotion as he listened to Walter's story. He didn't know what to say, couldn't find words adequate to address the terrible irony of the situation. Here was a man whose son had been killed by German forces, and yet that same man was treating German prisoners with kindness and respect. Heinrich finally managed to say that he was sorry for Walter's loss, that he understood the pain of losing loved ones to war, that he hoped Walter didn't hate him for wearing the same uniform as the men who had killed David. Walter looked at Heinrich for a long moment, his weathered face etched with grief and something else, something that looked like hard-won wisdom. Walter said quietly that he didn't hate Heinrich or any of the other prisoners, that hate wouldn't bring David back and wouldn't make the world any better. He said that his son had died fighting for freedom and for the belief that all people deserved to be treated with dignity, and that the best way to honor David's memory was to live according to those same principles. He said that Heinrich hadn't started this war, that he was just a young man who had been caught up in forces beyond his control, and that punishing him or treating him cruelly wouldn't change anything about the past. Walter's words were simple but profound, and Heinrich felt tears stinging his eyes as he realized that he was being given a gift, the gift of forgiveness from someone who had every reason to hate him. The two men sat on that barn roof for a while longer, looking out over the Iowa countryside as the sun sank lower in the sky. Neither spoke, but there was a sense of understanding between them that transcended words, a shared recognition of the human cost of war and the importance of maintaining one's humanity even in the darkest of times. When they finally climbed down from the roof and returned to the ground, Heinrich felt changed in some fundamental way, as if a weight he had been carrying for months had been lifted from his shoulders. Winter arrived in full force in December, bringing snow and freezing temperatures that transformed the Iowa landscape into a white expanse. The work on the farms slowed down during these cold months, but Walter still found tasks for Heinrich's work detail to do. They helped with maintenance projects in the barn, repaired equipment that would be needed for spring planting, cut and split firewood for the farmhouse and other buildings. Margaret Hoffman, who had initially been cautious around the German prisoners, gradually warmed to them as well, often inviting them into the farmhouse kitchen to warm up with hot coffee and fresh-baked cookies. Christmas of 1944 arrived while Heinrich was still at the POW camp in Iowa. The prisoners were allowed to hold their own Christmas Eve celebration in the mess hall, which they decorated with handmade ornaments and paper chains. Someone had fashioned a small Christmas tree from branches gathered outside the camp, and the men placed it in the center of the hall and gathered around to sing traditional German carols. The melancholy sound of Stille Nacht filled the room, and many of the prisoners wiped tears from their eyes as they thought of Christmases past with their families in Germany, wondering if they would ever see home again. On Christmas Day, Walter Hoffman did something extraordinary. He arranged with the camp commandant to have Heinrich's entire work detail brought to his farm for Christmas dinner. Captain Jenkins approved the request, recognizing that Walter's humane treatment of the prisoners had been beneficial for everyone involved, keeping the POWs productive and cooperative, while also maintaining positive relations with the local farming community. So on Christmas afternoon, Heinrich and 19 other German prisoners were transported to the Hoffman farm, where they were welcomed into the farmhouse itself, a privilege that left them speechless with gratitude and disbelief. The Hoffman farmhouse dining room had been transformed for the occasion. A long table covered with a white cloth ran down the center of the room, set with Margaret's best china and silverware. In the corner stood a Christmas tree decorated with candles, glass ornaments, and strings of popcorn and cranberries. The smell of roasting turkey and baking bread filled the air, making Heinrich's stomach growl with anticipation. Margaret and her two daughters, Anna and Elizabeth, had spent days preparing the feast, and they welcomed the prisoners with nervous smiles, still processing the strangeness of having enemy soldiers as guests in their home. Walter said grace before the meal, his voice steady and clear as he thanked God for the food, for the company, and for the opportunity to show mercy and kindness even in time of war. He prayed for an end to the conflict, for the safety of all soldiers on all sides, and for the day when Heinrich and the other prisoners could return home to their families. When he finished, there was a moment of profound silence in the room, broken only by the sound of someone quietly crying. Then, Margaret began serving the meal, and the room filled with the sounds of plates being passed, food being served, and tentative conversation beginning to flow. The dinner was magnificent by any standard, but after months of prison camp food, it felt like a feast fit for kings. There was roasted turkey with crispy skin and tender meat, mashed potatoes swimming in butter and gravy, green beans cooked with bacon, sweet potato casserole topped with marshmallows, cranberry sauce both jellied and wholeberry, fresh dinner rolls still warm from the oven, and more side dishes than Heinrich could keep track of. For dessert, Margaret brought out 3 pies, apple, pumpkin, and mincemeat, along with a pot of real coffee and fresh cream to go with it. The prisoners ate with a mixture of reverence and barely controlled hunger, trying to maintain proper table manners while also wanting to devour everything in sight. As the meal progressed, the atmosphere in the room gradually shifted from tense formality to something warmer and more relaxed. Walter and Josef engaged in a long conversation about literature and philosophy, discovering a shared love of Goethe and Schiller. Klaus helped Anna clear plates between courses, the two young people communicating mostly through smiles and gestures, since neither spoke the other's language fluently. Franz complimented Margaret on her cooking in his halting English, and she blushed with pleasure, explaining through Walter's translation how she had learned to make many of these dishes from her own mother and grandmother. Heinrich found himself sitting next to Elizabeth, Walter's younger daughter, who was 17 years old and studying at the local high school. She asked him about Germany, about what Munich was like, about whether the stories they heard on the radio about the war were true. Heinrich answered as honestly as he could, trying to explain the complexity of what had happened in Germany, how ordinary people had been swept up in the Nazi movement, how fear and propaganda had turned a nation toward darkness. He didn't excuse what Germany had done, but he tried to help her understand that not everyone in Germany had been a monster, that many people had simply been trying to survive, to protect their families, to make it through impossible circumstances. Elizabeth listened thoughtfully, her young face serious as she processed Heinrich's words. She told him that before the war, she had always imagined Germans as evil villains from movies and propaganda posters, but meeting Heinrich and the other prisoners had changed her perspective. She realized that they were just people, young men not much older than her own brother had been, men who had families and dreams and fears just like everyone else. She said that her brother David's death had filled her with rage at first, that she had wanted all Germans to suffer for what they had done to her family. But seeing her father treat the prisoners with kindness, seeing how they responded with gratitude and hard work, had made her question those feelings of hatred. She was beginning to understand what her father had tried to teach her, that individual human beings couldn't be held responsible for the actions of entire nations, that revenge and hatred only perpetuated cycles of violence. After dinner, the group moved to the living room where a fire crackled in the fireplace. Walter brought out a bottle of schnapps that he had been saving for a special occasion, and he poured small glasses for each of the prisoners and for himself. He raised his glass in a toast, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke in German about the importance of remembering our shared humanity, about the need to build bridges rather than walls, about his hope that someday soon the war would end and all these young men could return to their homes and families. The prisoners raised their glasses and drank, the schnapps burning warm down their throats, and in that moment the war felt very far away. Someone suggested singing Christmas carols, and soon the room filled with music as German and American voices blended together. They sang O Tannenbaum and Joy to the World, Silent Night in both German and English, and Hark the Herald Angels Sing. Margaret played piano, her fingers moving skillfully over the keys while her daughters harmonized with the deeper voices of the men. Heinrich closed his eyes and let the music wash over him, feeling a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced since before the war. In this moment, in this farmhouse in the middle of Iowa, surrounded by people who by all rights should have been his enemies, he felt more at home than he had in years. As the evening drew to a close and the time came for the prisoners to return to camp, Walter walked Heinrich to the door and placed a hand on his shoulder. He told Heinrich that he hoped the war would end soon, that Heinrich would survive and make it back to Germany, that he would find his family safe and be able to rebuild his life. He said that Heinrich was a good man, that the uniform he had worn didn't define who he was as a person, and that Walter would always remember him as the young German who had helped harvest his corn and who had spent Christmas in his home. Heinrich struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude, finally managing to say simply that this day would stay with him for the rest of his life, that Walter and his family had given him a gift far more valuable than any physical object, the gift of being treated with dignity and respect when he had expected nothing but contempt. The winter months passed slowly in Iowa, with January and February bringing some of the coldest weather Heinrich had ever experienced. The camp's heating system struggled to keep the barracks warm, and the prisoners huddled under their thin blankets at night, sometimes waking to find frost on the inside of the windows. But even in the depths of winter, the work continued. Heinrich's group was rotated among several different farms in the area, helping with whatever tasks needed doing during the agricultural off-season. Some farmers were kind, like Walter Hoffman, treating the prisoners with fairness and basic human decency. Others were distant and cold, viewing the Germans as nothing more than free labor to be exploited. A few were actively hostile, making cutting remarks about Nazi atrocities and working the prisoners harder than necessary as a form of punishment for Germany's sins. Heinrich learned to navigate these different situations with a combination of hard work, quiet dignity, and careful observation. He understood that these American farmers had legitimate reasons to distrust or even hate Germans. News of concentration camps and war crimes was beginning to filter through to the American public, and while Heinrich himself had not been involved in such atrocities, he wore the uniform of the nation that had committed them. He could not change the past or undo what Germany had done, but he could control how he conducted himself in the present. So he worked hard, followed orders, showed respect, and tried to demonstrate through his actions that not all Germans were monsters. In March of 1945, as the snow began to melt and the first hints of spring appeared in Iowa, news reached the camp that the war in Europe was entering its final phase. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine River and were pushing deep into Germany from the west, while Soviet armies advanced from the east. The German military was collapsing, cities were falling one after another, and it was clear that defeat was only a matter of time. The prisoners received this news with mixed emotions. On one hand, the end of the war meant the end of the killing, the end of the destruction, the possibility of eventually going home. On the other hand, they worried desperately about what was happening to their families in Germany, about whether their homes and cities were being destroyed in the final battles, about whether their loved ones would survive the chaos of defeat and occupation. Heinrich thought constantly about his mother and sister in Munich. He had been able to send them a few brief letters through the Red Cross, carefully worded messages that let them know he was alive and in good health, but he had received no replies. He didn't know if his letters had reached them, or if they were even still alive. Munich was being heavily bombed by Allied air forces, and Heinrich had heard stories of entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, of thousands of civilians killed in the raids. The uncertainty gnawed at him day and night, a constant anxiety that made it difficult to sleep or concentrate on anything else. In April, the prisoners learned that President Franklin Roosevelt had died, news that was greeted with mixed reactions in the camp. Some prisoners wondered if this might change the course of the war or the treatment of POWs, though most understood that the momentum toward German defeat was now unstoppable, regardless of who was leading America. The guards at the camp spoke in hushed, somber tones about Roosevelt's death, clearly deeply affected by the loss of their leader. Heinrich was struck by how personally Americans seemed to take the president's death, as if they had lost a family member rather than a distant political figure. It was different from Germany, where leaders were feared or worshipped but rarely mourned with genuine personal grief. Then, on May 8, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. Germany surrendered unconditionally, and the fighting that had consumed the continent for nearly 6 years finally ceased. In the POW camp in Iowa, the news was announced over loudspeakers during the morning roll call. Captain Jenkins stood before the assembled prisoners and told them in English, with an interpreter translating into German, that the war was over, that Germany had been defeated, and that while they would remain prisoners for now, arrangements would eventually be made for their repatriation. The captain's tone was neither triumphant nor cruel, simply matter of fact, as if he were announcing the results of a sporting match rather than the outcome of history's most destructive conflict. The prisoners received the news in stunned silence. Some men wept openly, their shoulders shaking with sobs as the reality of defeat sank in. Others stood stone-faced and rigid, refusing to show emotion in front of their captors or their fellow prisoners. A few actually looked relieved, as if a terrible burden had been lifted from their shoulders. Heinrich felt numb, unable to fully process what he was hearing. Germany had lost. The Third Reich had fallen. Everything he had been taught about German superiority and inevitable victory had been revealed as lies and propaganda. All the death and destruction, all the suffering and sacrifice had been for nothing. His country lay in ruins, occupied by foreign armies, its cities destroyed, its people homeless and starving. But mixed in with the grief and shock was also a sense of relief that surprised Heinrich. The war was over. The killing had stopped. He had survived, and there was now at least a chance that his mother and sister had survived as well. He would not have to fight anymore, would not have to kill or risk being killed. Whatever happened next, at least the immediate horror of combat was behind him. And perhaps, if he was very lucky, he might someday make it back to Germany and try to rebuild something from the ashes of defeat. In the days following the surrender, the atmosphere in the camp shifted subtly. The guards seemed more relaxed, less vigilant, as if the prisoners were now viewed as defeated remnants rather than potential threats. Some of the American soldiers who had been stationed at the camp were reassigned to other duties, their services no longer needed now that the war had ended. The work details continued as before, since the farm still needed labor and the prisoners still needed to be kept occupied, but there was a sense that everyone was simply going through the motions while waiting to see what would happen next. Heinrich's group returned to the Hoffman farm in late May as the corn planting season began. Spring had fully arrived in Iowa by then, with the fields turning green and wildflowers blooming along the roadsides. Walter greeted them warmly, his face showing relief that the war was finally over and that these young men had survived to see peace. He set the prisoners to work, preparing fields for planting, running tractors and plows to turn the rich Iowa soil and create neat furrows ready for seed. The work was hard and repetitive, but there was something satisfying about it, a sense of participating in creation rather than destruction, of helping things grow rather than tearing them down. During breaks, Walter talked with the prisoners about what might happen to them now that the war had ended. He explained that the process of repatriating hundreds of thousands of POWs would take time, possibly years, and that in the meantime they would likely continue working on American farms. He had heard that some prisoners might even be given the option of staying in America permanently if they wished, though the details of such a program were still unclear. Walter asked Heinrich if he would consider staying in Iowa, said that he would be happy to sponsor Heinrich as a farmhand if immigration authorities would allow it. There would always be work on the farm, Walter said, and Heinrich had proven himself to be a skilled and reliable worker. Heinrich was touched by the offer, but found himself uncertain how to respond. Part of him was drawn to the idea of staying in America, of building a new life in this peaceful place far from the devastation of Europe. Iowa had been good to him, better than he had any right to expect, and he had come to feel a genuine affection for this land and these people who had treated him with such unexpected kindness. But another part of him felt an obligation to return to Germany, to search for his family, to help rebuild his shattered country. He told Walter that he appreciated the offer more than he could express, but that he needed to find out what had happened to his mother and sister before he could make any decisions about his future. Walter nodded in understanding, saying that family had to come first and that the offer would remain open if Heinrich ever changed his mind. He told Heinrich that whatever happened, wherever life took him, he should remember that he had friends in Iowa, people who cared about him and wished him well. Margaret echoed these sentiments when Heinrich saw her later that day, pressing a small package into his hands and telling him it was for when he finally made it home. Inside, Heinrich found a carefully wrapped fruitcake, the kind Margaret traditionally made for special occasions, along with a handwritten note in German that read, "May God protect you on your journey and bring you safely back to your family." The summer of 1945 passed in a kind of suspended animation for the prisoners at the Iowa camp. They continued their work on the farms, continued their daily routines, but everyone knew that this situation was temporary, that eventually they would be sent back to Germany. News from Europe was grim. The continent was in chaos, with millions of displaced persons trying to find their way home, cities reduced to rubble, infrastructure destroyed, food supplies critically low. The Soviet occupation zone in eastern Germany was particularly concerning, with reports of harsh treatment of German civilians and prisoners. Heinrich prayed that Munich, located in what would become the American occupation zone, had not suffered too terribly, though he knew that his prayers might be in vain. In August, the war in the Pacific ended with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's subsequent surrender. The prisoners at the Iowa camp heard about the atomic bomb with a mixture of awe and horror, struggling to comprehend a weapon of such devastating power. Some wondered if Germany had been spared such destruction only because the bomb had not been ready in time, while others debated the morality of using such a weapon against civilian populations. Heinrich thought about the Allied bombing raids on German cities that he had witnessed before his deployment to North Africa, remembered the firestorms that had consumed Hamburg and Dresden, and wondered how much difference there really was between being killed by thousands of conventional bombs or by a single atomic explosion. Dead was dead, and the cause of death seemed almost irrelevant when measured against the scale of destruction that modern warfare could achieve. As autumn arrived once again in Iowa, word came down from the camp authorities that preparations were being made for the repatriation of German POWs. The process would be gradual, with prisoners being sent back to Germany in waves over the course of many months. Priority would be given to men whose families were known to be alive and waiting for them, then to men from regions that were under stable occupation, and finally to everyone else. Heinrich had still not received any confirmation that his mother and sister had survived, so he knew he would likely be in one of the later groups to be sent home. The waiting was agonizing, each day bringing hope that there might be news, and each evening bringing disappointment when there was none. In October, Heinrich and his work group returned to the Hoffman farm one last time to help with the corn harvest, exactly 1 year after their first day working in those fields. So much had changed in that year, yet in some ways everything was the same. The corn still grew tall and golden, still needed to be picked by hand, still filled sack after sack with its heavy yellow ears. Walter was still there with his patience and his kindness, still teaching and joking and treating the prisoners like valued workers rather than defeated enemies. But there was a bittersweet quality to this final harvest, a sense that something precious was coming to an end. On the last day of work at the Hoffman farm, Walter organized a farewell gathering for Heinrich's group. Margaret prepared a feast much like the one they had shared at Christmas, though without quite the same abundance since wartime rationing was still in effect. The prisoners sat around the table in the barn, eating and talking and laughing, trying to memorize every detail of this moment, because they knew they might never see these people again. Walter made a short speech in which he thanked the prisoners for their hard work, for their good behavior, and for reminding him that even in the darkest times it was possible to maintain one's humanity and treat others with dignity and respect. Then, to everyone's surprise, Walter presented each prisoner with a gift. For Heinrich, it was a small wooden box that Walter had made himself in his workshop. Inside the box was a single ear of dried corn from the previous year's harvest, the same ear that Heinrich had been given on his very first day of work and had kept in his footlocker all these months. Walter had noticed the dried corn in Heinrich's belongings during one of the camp inspections and had asked if he could borrow it to create this gift. He had mounted the ear of corn on a small wooden plaque inside the box and had carved an inscription on the inside of the lid. It read in German, "From Iowa soil to German hands, may you always remember that enemies can become friends and that harvest time brings people together. With gratitude and respect, Walter Hoffman, October 1945. Heinrich held the box in his hands, feeling the smooth wood that Walter had sanded and polished with such care, looking at the dried corn that represented his first moment of being treated with dignity as a prisoner, reading the inscription that perfectly captured what this experience had meant to him. He tried to speak, to thank Walter properly, but found that his throat was too tight with emotion to form words. Instead, he simply embraced Walter, holding the older man tightly while tears streamed down his face. Around him, other prisoners were receiving their own gifts and having their own emotional farewells, creating a scene of unexpected tenderness between former enemies who had become something like friends. As the truck pulled away from the Hoffman farm for the final time, Heinrich looked back at the white farmhouse with its green shutters, at the red barn where they had shared so many meals, at the cornfields that stretched into the distance. He wondered if he would ever see this place again, if the memory of this year in Iowa would remain vivid and clear, or if it would fade over time into something dreamlike and uncertain. He wondered if Walter and Margaret would remember him, or if he would become just another face among the hundreds of German prisoners who had worked on farms across America during the war years. He hoped he would never forget them, never forget the kindness they had shown him when they had no obligation to do so, never forget the lesson they had taught him about the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation even after terrible conflict. The winter of 1945 to 1946 was the coldest and hardest that Heinrich experienced at the camp. Fuel was scarce, food supplies were reduced as farms prepared for the prisoners' eventual departure, and a sense of restless anxiety pervaded the barracks as men waited to learn when they would be sent home. Some prisoners received letters from families in Germany, brief notes filled with stories of destruction and hardship, but also joy that their loved ones had survived. Heinrich received no letters. He tried to maintain hope, telling himself that the postal system was simply overwhelmed, that his mother and sister were alive but unable to get messages through the chaos of post-war Germany. But as weeks turned into months with no news, a dark fear began to grow in his heart. In February of 1946, Heinrich's name finally appeared on a list of prisoners scheduled for repatriation. He would be leaving Iowa in March, traveling by train to New York and then by ship back to Europe. The news brought a complicated mix of emotions. He was desperate to return to Germany, to search for his family, to see what remained of his homeland. But he was also sad to leave Iowa, this place that had been kinder to him than he had any right to expect. These people who had treated him with humanity when they could have been cruel. On his final evening at the camp, Heinrich took out the wooden box that Walter had given him, opened it carefully, and looked at the dried ear of corn mounted inside. He traced the inscription with his finger, reading the words again and again, committing them to memory so that he would never forget. The journey back to Germany was long and uncomfortable, just as the journey to America had been nearly 2 years earlier. Heinrich and several hundred other prisoners were loaded onto a Liberty ship in New York Harbor and sent across the Atlantic to the port of Le Havre in France. From there, they were transported by train to processing centers in the American occupation zone of Germany, where they would be officially released from prisoner status and given papers allowing them to travel within the country. The train journey through France and into Germany was sobering. Heinrich pressed his face against the window and watched as the landscape of destruction rolled past. Cities that he remembered from before the war were now unrecognizable, reduced to fields of rubble with only the occasional wall or chimney standing amid the ruins. Rivers were choked with debris and destroyed bridges. Refugees trudged along the roads carrying their possessions in bags and carts. Displaced persons trying to find their way back to homes that might no longer exist. When the train finally crossed into Germany, Heinrich felt a complicated surge of emotion. This was his homeland, the country he had fought for, the place where he had been born and raised. But it was also a defeated nation, occupied by foreign armies, its cities destroyed, its people hungry and desperate. Germany had gambled everything on conquest and domination, and it had lost catastrophically. The price of that loss was evident everywhere Heinrich looked, in the rubble-strewn streets, in the hollow-eyed faces of civilians, in the columns of prisoners being marched under guard, in the presence of American and British military police on every corner. The processing center where Heinrich was released was located in a former Wehrmacht barracks near Stuttgart. He stood in long lines for hours, filling out forms, being photographed and fingerprinted, receiving identity papers and ration cards. When the process was finally complete, when he was officially no longer a prisoner of war but a free German citizen, Heinrich stood outside the barracks holding his small bundle of possessions and tried to decide what to do next. Munich was several hundred miles to the southeast, and travel was difficult with most of the railway system destroyed or operating on limited schedules. But he had to get there, had to find out what had happened to his family, had to know whether his mother and sister were alive or dead. The journey to Munich took 3 days and involved hitchhiking on military trucks, walking long stretches of damaged roads, and catching rides on the few civilian trains that were running. Heinrich encountered thousands of other displaced persons on the roads, all of them trying to get somewhere, all of them searching for family or friends or any familiar face that might provide a connection to their former lives. He shared what little food he had with an elderly woman who was walking to Berlin to look for her daughter. He helped a group of children whose parents had been killed in an air raid find their way to an orphanage in Nuremberg. He saw suffering and desperation everywhere, the human cost of the war laid bare in the faces of defeated Germany. When Heinrich finally arrived in Munich, he almost didn't recognize his hometown. The city center was heavily damaged, with whole neighborhoods reduced to ruins. The beautiful churches and historic buildings he remembered from his youth were either destroyed or heavily scarred by bombs. The streets were filled with rubble that had been partially cleared to create narrow pathways for vehicles and pedestrians. People moved through the destruction like ghosts, their faces gaunt and tired, their clothes shabby and patched. American soldiers were everywhere, directing traffic, distributing food, maintaining order in a city that seemed to be teetering on the edge of chaos. Heinrich made his way through the ruins to the neighborhood where his family's apartment building had stood. His heart sank as he approached the street, seeing that many of the buildings were damaged or destroyed. But as he got closer, he saw that his building was still standing, though it was missing its top floor and had significant damage to one side. The ground floor appeared to be inhabited, with clothes hanging from makeshift lines strung across empty window frames and smoke rising from a chimney that suggested someone was cooking inside. Heinrich's hands shook as he approached the building and entered through the damaged front door. The interior was dark and smelled of dampness and smoke. Heinrich climbed the stairs to the third floor where his family's apartment had been, his footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. When he reached the right door, he stood for a moment before knocking, afraid of what he might find or might not find. Finally, he raised his hand and knocked 3 times, the signal his family had always used to identify themselves. For a long moment there was silence. Then he heard footsteps approaching, heard the sound of multiple locks being undone, and the door opened a crack. His sister Anna stood in the doorway, though Heinrich almost didn't recognize her. She had been 16 when he left for the war, a bright-eyed girl with long blonde braids and a quick smile. Now she was 18, thin and worn-looking, her hair cut short, her face marked by hardship. She stared at Heinrich for a moment as if unable to believe what she was seeing. Then her eyes went wide and she screamed, "Heinrich! Mama, it's Heinrich! He's alive!" She threw herself into his arms, sobbing and laughing at the same time, holding him so tightly that Heinrich could barely breathe. His mother appeared behind Anna, moving slowly with the aid of a cane. She had aged 10 years in the time Heinrich had been gone, her hair now completely gray, her face deeply lined, but her eyes were the same, sharp and intelligent, and now filling with tears as she looked at her son standing in the doorway. She reached out and touched his face with trembling fingers, as if to make sure he was real and not a ghost or a dream. "You came home," she whispered in German. "My boy came home to me." Heinrich went to her and embraced her carefully, aware of how fragile she felt in his arms, how much the war had taken from her physically and emotionally. They went inside the apartment, which was smaller than Heinrich remembered, because part of it had been destroyed in a bombing raid. The family was now living in just 2 rooms, sharing their reduced space with another family who had been bombed out of their home. But it was shelter, it was safety, and most importantly, it was home. Heinrich sat at the small table in the kitchen area while his mother and sister prepared what food they had, which amounted to some bread and a thin soup made from potatoes and turnips. It was meager by the standards Heinrich had become accustomed to in Iowa, where even prison camp food had been adequate and farm meals had been abundant. But it was served with love, and Heinrich ate gratefully, savoring every bite while Anna bombarded him with questions about where he had been, what had happened to him, whether he had been hurt or mistreated. Heinrich told them about his capture in North Africa, about the journey to America, about the camp in Iowa. He told them about Walter Hoffman and the cornfields, about learning to harvest corn and being treated with unexpected kindness by people who had every reason to hate him. He told them about Christmas dinner in the farmhouse, about the friendships he had made with the other prisoners, about the farmer whose son had been killed at Normandy, but who had chosen forgiveness over hatred. As he talked, he pulled out the wooden box that Walter had given him and showed it to his mother and sister, opening it carefully to reveal the dried ear of corn and the inscription carved into the lid. Anna read the inscription aloud in German, her voice soft with wonder. "Enemies can become friends," she repeated. "Is that really possible, Heinrich? After everything that has happened, after all the terrible things our country has done, can Germans and Americans really be friends?" Heinrich thought about Walter's hand on his shoulder, about Margaret's kindness, about Elizabeth's willingness to see beyond propaganda and recognize the humanity in former enemies. He thought about the Christmas carols sung in harmony, about the shared meals, about the simple act of being given an ear of corn and being told that his work had value. "Yes," Heinrich said firmly, "I believe it is possible. I have seen it with my own eyes, but it requires courage. The courage to let go of hatred and choose compassion instead. The courage to see individuals rather than stereotypes. The courage to offer forgiveness even when it is not deserved or expected." He looked at his mother, who was listening quietly while turning the wooden box over in her hands, examining the craftsmanship with the practiced eye of a seamstress who appreciated fine work. Walter Hoffman lost his son because of Germany, because of the war that we started. He had every right to treat me and the other prisoners with cruelty, but instead he chose kindness. He chose to honor his son's memory by living according to the principles his son had died defending. That is the kind of courage I want to have as we rebuild our lives here. His mother nodded slowly, her eyes distant as she processed what Heinrich was saying. Finally, she spoke. The war has taken so much from us. Your father died before it even started, but the hardships it brought killed him as surely as a bullet would have. We lost our home, our possessions, everything we had built over years of hard work. Anna and I have lived on the edge of starvation for months, have seen friends and neighbors killed in the bombing raids, have watched our beautiful city reduced to ruins. There were times when I felt nothing but rage, when I hated the Americans and British for what their bombs were doing to us, when I wanted nothing more than revenge for all the suffering we had endured. She paused and looked at Heinrich, her weathered face reflecting decades of hard-won wisdom. But hatred is a poison that destroys the one who carries it more than the one it is directed toward. I cannot spend whatever years I have left consumed by bitterness over things I cannot change. If an American farmer could show kindness to my son when he was a prisoner, then perhaps there is hope that we can find ways to heal and move forward. The alternative is to remain trapped in cycles of revenge and counter-revenge that will destroy us all. The three of them sat together in that damaged apartment, talking late into the night about the war, about survival, about the future. Anna told Heinrich about the bombing raids, about the nights spent in shelters while the city was torn apart above them, about the day their apartment building was hit and part of it collapsed, killing several neighbors. She told him about the chaos when the Americans arrived to occupy Munich, about the fear that had gripped the city as people waited to see how the conquerors would treat them. But she also told him about the relief when it became clear that the Americans were not interested in massacring civilians, that they were distributing food to the hungry population, that they were starting to restore order and basic services. Heinrich's mother talked about the letters she had tried to send to him through the Red Cross, letters that had apparently never reached the POW camp in Iowa. She had known that Heinrich had been captured, but had no idea where he was being held, whether he was alive or dead, whether she would ever see him again. The uncertainty had been agonizing, worse in some ways than if she had received definitive news of his death, because at least then she would have known and could have grieved properly. Instead, she had lived in a state of suspended hope, praying every day that her son was alive somewhere, that he would survive the war and find his way back to her. As the conversation continued, Heinrich found himself telling them more details about his time in Iowa, stories that illustrated the unexpected humanity he had encountered. He told them about Joseph, the former teacher who had engaged Walter in philosophical discussions, about Klaus, the farmer's son who had proven to be the fastest corn picker, about Franz, the quiet carpenter who had helped repair the Hoffman barn. He told them about the guards at the camp who had been professional but not cruel, about Captain Jenkins, who had run the facility with fairness and efficiency, about the American soldiers he had met who seemed more interested in going home to their families than in punishing defeated enemies. He also told them about the darker moments, the farmers who had been hostile or cold, the constant awareness that he was a prisoner and an enemy, the fear that had lived in the pit of his stomach during those first uncertain days when he didn't know how he would be treated. He was honest about the humiliation of surrender, about the shame of knowing that his country had committed terrible crimes in the name of ideologies he had never fully believed in, about the guilt of having survived when so many of his comrades had not. War was complicated, Heinrich explained, and being on the losing side meant carrying burdens that would never fully disappear. Over the following weeks and months, Heinrich worked to rebuild his life in post-war Munich. He found employment with an American construction company that was hiring Germans to help clear rubble and rebuild damaged structures. The work was hard and the pay was modest, but it provided money that helped support his mother and sister. He worked alongside other former soldiers, men who had served in various branches of the Wehrmacht and had now returned home to find their country in ruins. Some of these men were bitter and resentful, clinging to Nazi ideology and blaming everyone but themselves for Germany's defeat. Others were pragmatic and focused on survival, willing to work for the occupation forces if it meant feeding their families. And a few, like Heinrich, were trying to process what had happened and find ways to move forward without being consumed by the past. Heinrich never forgot the lessons he had learned in Iowa. The wooden box with the dried ear of corn sat on a small shelf in the apartment, and Heinrich looked at it every day as a reminder of what was possible when people chose compassion over hatred. When he encountered former soldiers who spoke with bitterness about Americans or who clung to fantasies of Germany rising again to seek revenge, Heinrich would tell them about Walter Hoffmann, about a farmer who had lost his son to German bullets, but who had still chosen to treat German prisoners with dignity and respect. Some men listened and were moved by the story. Others dismissed it as naive sentimentality or accused Heinrich of being a traitor for speaking kindly about the enemy. But Heinrich kept telling the story anyway, believing that it contained truth that Germany desperately needed to hear. In the spring of 1947, more than a year after his return to Germany, Heinrich received an unexpected package in the mail. It had been sent from Iowa and had taken months to make its way through the military postal system and into civilian hands. Inside, Heinrich found a letter from Walter Hoffmann, written in careful German script, and telling Heinrich that he hoped this letter would find him safe and reunited with his family. Walter wrote about the farm, about how the 1946 corn harvest had been good, about how he and Margaret often thought about Heinrich and the other prisoners who had worked on their land during the war years. Walter said that he had written to other prisoners whose addresses he had been able to find, wanting to maintain contact with the young men who had briefly been part of his life. The letter also contained news that made Heinrich's heart ache. Walter wrote that Elizabeth, his younger daughter, had decided to become a teacher, inspired in part by conversations she had with Josef, the former German teacher who had been part of Heinrich's work detail. She was attending college in Iowa City and planned to specialize in international relations and language education, hoping to contribute to building bridges between cultures and preventing future conflicts. Walter wrote that Elizabeth sent her greetings to Heinrich and wanted him to know that meeting the German prisoners had profoundly affected her worldview and her career choices. Along with the letter, Walter had enclosed a small packet of hybrid corn seeds, the kind that Iowa farmers use to grow their abundant crops. He suggested that Heinrich might want to plant them somewhere in Germany as a reminder of his time in Iowa and as a symbol of growth and renewal. Heinrich held the packet of seeds in his hand, feeling their weight and thinking about what they represented. These seeds came from Iowa soil, from the fields where he had labored as a prisoner, from the farm where he had been treated with unexpected kindness. Now they were in Germany, in the ruins of Munich, ready to grow in soil that had been scarred by war but was still capable of producing life. Heinrich found a small plot of land on the outskirts of Munich where he received permission to plant a garden. In the early summer of 1947, he carefully planted the corn seeds that Walter had sent, following the techniques he had learned in Iowa. He prepared the soil, created proper rows, planted the seeds at the right depth and spacing, and then waited to see if they would grow. For weeks he visited the plot every day, checking for signs of germination, watering when necessary, pulling weeds that threatened to choke out the emerging seedlings. And gradually, miraculously, the corn began to grow. The stalks pushed up through the German soil, reaching toward the sun, growing taller day by day. News of Heinrich's Iowa corn spread through the neighborhood, and people came to see the unusual crop. Many Germans had never seen American-style corn before, and they were amazed by how tall the plants grew, how large the ears became. Heinrich shared the story of how he had come to have these seeds, telling anyone who would listen about his time as a prisoner in Iowa, about Walter Hoffmann and his family, about the kindness he had been shown when he expected only cruelty. The corn became something of a local curiosity, a living symbol of unexpected connections forged during wartime and maintained in the difficult years of peace. When the corn was ready to harvest that autumn, Heinrich invited his neighbors to join him in picking it. He showed them the technique he had learned from Walter, demonstrating how to grasp the ear firmly and twist it downward to break it free from the stalk. Together, they harvested the corn, and then Heinrich did what Walter had done for him. He invited everyone who had helped with the harvest to share a meal, cooking the corn in large pots and serving it with butter and salt. As his neighbors ate the Iowa corn in the ruins of Munich, Heinrich told them again about the farmer who had chosen forgiveness over hatred, about the lesson that enemies could become friends, about the importance of maintaining one's humanity even in the darkest of times. Heinrich's mother, watching her son share corn and stories with the neighbors, felt a profound sense of gratitude that her boy had come home, not just physically, but also spiritually intact. The war had damaged so many men, leaving them bitter and broken, unable to find meaning or hope in the post-war world. But Heinrich seemed to have found something precious during his time as a prisoner, a wisdom that came from having experienced both the worst and the best of human nature. She understood now why he kept that wooden box with the dried ear of corn, why he looked at it every day, why he had been so determined to plant the Iowa seeds in German soil. It was his way of keeping hope alive, of believing that growth and renewal were possible even in the most devastated of landscapes. Years passed, and slowly, painfully, Germany began to rebuild. The Marshall Plan brought American aid that helped reconstruct the shattered economy and infrastructure. New buildings rose from the rubble of destroyed cities. The currency was reformed, bringing stability and enabling commerce to resume. People who had lived on the edge of starvation began to have enough to eat again. Democracy was reestablished in the western zones of Germany, creating institutions that would eventually form the foundation of a new German state. It was not an easy process, and there were many setbacks and challenges along the way. But gradually, life began to feel less like mere survival and more like actual living. Heinrich continued to work in construction, eventually becoming a foreman, supervising crews of workers on major rebuilding projects in Munich. He married Anna Schmidt, a widow whose husband had been killed in the war and who was raising a young daughter alone. Together, Heinrich and his new wife built a modest but comfortable life, moving into a small house on the outskirts of Munich, near where Heinrich had planted his Iowa corn garden. He continued to plant corn every year, saving seeds from each harvest to plant the next season, maintaining the living connection to Walter Hoffman and the lessons learned in Iowa. Heinrich and Walter maintained a correspondence that lasted for decades. Letters traveled back and forth across the Atlantic, sharing news of families and farms, discussing the changing world, reflecting on the war years and what they had learned from each other. In 1952, Walter sent a photograph of himself standing in his cornfield, the stalks tall and golden, just as Heinrich remembered them. In 1958, Heinrich sent a photograph of his own corn crop in Germany. The plants descended from the original Iowa seeds, still growing strong after more than a decade. The photographs were more than simple images. They were testament to something that had survived the war, a connection between two men who had started as enemies, but had become something far more meaningful. In 1963, Heinrich received devastating news from Iowa. Walter Hoffman had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73. Margaret had written to inform Heinrich, saying that Walter had often spoken of the German prisoners who had worked on their farm, that he had considered his decision to treat them with kindness and respect to be one of the most important choices of his life. Margaret wrote that in his final days, Walter had asked her to make sure Heinrich knew how much their friendship had meant to him, how it had helped him process his grief over David's death and find meaning in the tragedy of war. She enclosed a photograph of Walter's gravestone, along with an invitation for Heinrich to visit Iowa someday if he ever had the opportunity. Heinrich wept when he read the letter, mourning the loss of a man who had fundamentally changed his life, who had shown him that forgiveness was possible, that enemies could indeed become friends. He placed the letter in the wooden box alongside the dried ear of corn, adding it to the collection of physical objects that represented the most transformative experience of his life. That evening, he stood in his garden looking at the Iowa corn growing there, thinking about Walter and everything he had taught him about dignity, compassion, and the courage it takes to choose kindness over hatred. Heinrich never made it to Iowa. The cost of transatlantic travel was beyond his means, and as the years passed and his own health declined, the journey became impossible. But the connection remained, passed down through generations as Heinrich told his children and grandchildren about his time as a prisoner in America, about the farmer who had treated him like a human being, about the corn harvest that had changed his understanding of what was possible between former enemies. The wooden box with its dried ear of corn became a family heirloom, carefully preserved and displayed in each successive home as a reminder of an unlikely friendship forged in the aftermath of terrible conflict. When Heinrich died in 1987 at the age of 65, his grandson discovered among his possessions a worn journal that Heinrich had kept during his later years. In it, Heinrich had written extensively about his experiences in Iowa, recording details and reflections that he had never shared verbally. On the final page, written in Heinrich's shaky handwriting during what must have been his last days, was a passage that summarized what those months in Iowa had meant to him. "I went to America as a prisoner, expecting punishment and humiliation," Heinrich had written. "Instead, I found kindness and dignity. Walter Hoffman taught me that our humanity is not defined by the uniforms we wear or the nations we fight for, but by how we choose to treat others when we have the power to be cruel, but decide to be compassionate instead. He lost his son to my country's aggression, yet he chose to honor that son's memory through acts of forgiveness rather than revenge. In doing so, he saved not just my body from harsh treatment, but my soul from bitterness and despair. I came home from Iowa with more than just survival. I came home with hope, with a vision of what the world could be if more people had Walter's courage to choose love over hate. That hope sustained me through the difficult years of rebuilding, through the times when it would have been easy to surrender to cynicism and resentment. Every year when I plant my Iowa corn, I remember that even the most unlikely seeds can take root and grow if given the right conditions. We must be those conditions for each other, creating the soil where forgiveness can flourish and enemies can become friends." The wooden box and the journal were eventually donated to a museum in Munich dedicated to reconciliation and peace education. There, visitors can see the dried ear of corn, read Walter's inscription about enemies becoming friends, and learn the story of a German prisoner of war who found unexpected humanity in an Iowa cornfield. Schoolchildren come on field trips to hear about Heinrich Krause and Walter Hoffman, learning that even in the darkest chapters of history, individual acts of kindness and courage can create ripples that extend far beyond their immediate moment. The story has been told and retold, adapted into educational materials, referenced in discussions about prisoner of war treatment and post-war reconciliation. It stands as a reminder that wars are fought by nations and governments, but peace is built by individuals who choose compassion over cruelty, understanding over prejudice, forgiveness over revenge. Heinrich and Walter never set out to be symbols or to teach lessons to future generations. They were simply two men doing what they believed was right, guided by conscience rather than hatred, by faith in human dignity rather than the dehumanizing logic of total war. In Iowa, the Hoffman farm continued to be worked by Walter's descendants, the land still producing abundant harvests of corn and other crops. The family kept their own records of the German prisoners who had worked there during the war, preserving letters and photographs that documented those unusual years when enemies labored side by side in American fields. When Margaret Hoffman finally passed away in 1976, she left instructions that a portion of the farm's annual corn harvest should be donated to international relief organizations working to feed hungry people regardless of their nationality or the political circumstances that created their need. It was her way of extending Walter's philosophy of compassionate treatment to a global scale, of continuing to plant seeds of kindness that might grow in unexpected places. The final words of Heinrich's journal have become something of a motto for the museum in Munich, carved into a wooden plaque displayed near the entrance where every visitor can see them. "Enemies can become friends," the plaque reads, echoing Walter's inscription. It requires only courage, compassion, and the willingness to see the human being behind the uniform. May we all have such courage when it is needed most. And so the story of a German prisoner and an Iowa farmer lives on, a testament to the possibility of reconciliation, a reminder that even in times of war and hatred, individual human beings retain the capacity for extraordinary decency. It is a story about corn and harvests, about hard work and shared meals, about the simple but profound act of treating others with dignity when no one would blame you for doing otherwise. Most importantly, it is a story about hope, about the stubborn insistence that a better world is possible if we are brave enough to build it, one act of kindness at a time, one harvest at a time, one friendship at a time. Heinrich Krause went to Iowa as a defeated enemy. He came home as a man who had glimpsed what humanity could achieve when it chose its better angels. That vision sustained him for the rest of his life, and through his story, it continues to inspire others long after both he and Walter Hoffmann have passed into memory. Their legacy is not monuments or grand gestures, but something simpler and more profound, the enduring truth that enemies can indeed become friends, and that harvest time, whether in Iowa or Germany or anywhere else, has the power to bring people together in ways that war can never tear apart.